But I think one of the things I've learned is that Irish theatre is not having a deep enough conversation with itself. That conversation is only really beginning to start now, and we actually need to be much more structured in terms of how we approach that, I think. My name is Loughlin Deegan. I'm the director of the Lyre Academy at Trinity College Dublin, which is the National Academy of Dramatic Art. I've spent my entire professional life working in Irish theatre, initially as an administrator, briefly as a playwright, but primarily as a producer, including previously artistic director of Dublin Theatre Festival and now working here at the Lyre as artistic director. We're now 10 years old this year, in September. So we're a young organisation. It was very interesting over that time. I suppose the most significant event that happened in terms of equality and diversity was Waking the Feminists in 2016, which had a really, really seismic impact on Irish theatre in particular, but actually more broadly across the arts in Ireland and arguably across society. And we were very active in that process of the theatre community asking very hard questions of itself and really wanting to put changes in place that meant that we would genuinely work to create equality of opportunity for all genders working in Irish theatre. And so working with a number of other arts organisations, we went through a shared process of developing a very comprehensive gender equality policy, which had real targets in there, that was determined that it would initiate genuine change, and that change would be measurable, and that we would be held to account in that regard. So we did a huge amount of work at that time, including setting up a subcommittee of our board, an Access, Diversity and Equality subcommittee, to which we report to every year with regard to the targets that we've established for ourselves in that policy. It's a very, very constructive and progressive process actually, and I think we came out of it as a better organisation, and I think Irish theatre actually is in a much better place as a result of that really deep questioning and deep learning that it went through during that period. Interestingly then, following the George Floyd murder, the students themselves called on us to become much more active in terms of not just expressing support for the Black Lives Matter movement, but also to actually, in a similar way, work to initiate real change and to ensure that the Lyre would work to becoming a non-racist organisation in a really transparent, structured way. And so, following a call from the students, we had a large town hall meeting of all students and staff and teachers to talk about how we might move forward in that regard. Again, a really, really positive conversation, interestingly, a young organisation that was really determined that even though it didn't have baggage and history like other drama schools might have had, or indeed did have in terms of racism in particular, that we saw an opportunity for us to really work at, asking questions about ourselves even at 10 years of age, looking at all of our processes, all of our curriculums to see, how might we better ensure that everybody would be welcome at the Lyre and feel they had an equality of opportunity at the Lyre. So we agreed to set up a forum, and we initially realised that we had to have a minority of white people on that forum, so that was a very interesting discovery for us. And as a result, we invited back as many of our black graduates and graduates of colour as possible, and we have now achieved that. It's chaired by the actor Ealaíon Metfin, who's also the chair of our subcommittee, and we're working through a very kind of structured process of listening, learning, understanding, questioning, with a view to, after a year's work, developing a similar policy that will ensure that we are putting structures in place that guarantee, I suppose, we continue working as a non-racist organisation, and again we will be measured against targets, and we will be held to account as an institution and an organisation by our board in this regard. And so diversity has become an absolute priority for us as an organisation, and I think probably the #1 priority for us as an organisation. It was very interesting that lots of the students and the graduates started off by saying that they didn't think the Lyre was a racist organisation in any way, that they had never really experienced racism at the Lyre. But actually when we got further into the conversation, it was clear that many things had happened that actually had an impact, that were upsetting, were hurtful, that microaggressions are significant, we began to realise that even though we're a very well-meaning, progressive, open-minded organisation, that we have work to do. And I think all organisations have work to do in terms of genuinely making progress in this area. The other thing I think that's surprised me, and it's connected to that, is that when we ask the graduates and the students, what might we do in order to call out microaggressions, or to ensure that, if somebody's behaviour was having a negative impact or was hurtful, how might we call that out? How might we name that? How might we manage that process? The students themselves said that they didn't necessarily want to be the focus, that they didn't want to be put in a position where they were appropriating blame. What they wanted was support in response to the impact of the microaggression itself. What we're talking about now is having somebody that students can go to who's not directly involved in their teaching or their learning, where they can talk about the impact of the racism that they are experiencing, even if it is at a microaggression level. So what we're looking at is putting more supports in place for students to allow them to process and understand and deal with any experiences that they might have, while also acknowledging that we also need processes in place to call things out if we need to. We train stage managers, technicians, directors, designers, playwrights, but I think, actors play characters, and characters have ethnicity. You have, family members. Actors traditionally needed to look like brother and sister, for example. And I think theatre, we learned a lot from the UK through the 90s, particularly when colourblind casting, for example, was introduced, and people thought was the solution. It's clear now actually that that's not nearly enough. But I think one of the things I've learned is that Irish theatre is not having a deep enough conversation with itself. Unlike the conversation we had around gender, for example, that conversation is only really beginning to start now, and we actually need to be much more structured in terms of how we approach that. I think there needs to be leadership across the theatre community in terms of facilitating this conversation, because I think it's clear, hearing from our black actors and actors of colour who have graduated from the Lear, that they find Irish theatre a lot less welcoming than they find Irish TV and film production, for example. And in a way, that's because the film community has had a much more meaningful conversation coming out of Oscars So White in particular. And it's really clear that there's comprehensive change has happened and is happening within TV and film casting and production in particular. And the casting directors, for example, need and want diversity in the casting pool. They want us to be training black actors and actors of colour, because actually, for example, a lot of the the TV production that's coming from America that's been shot here in Ireland, a stipulation will come from LA to say that we expect X% of actors of colour or black actors in the casting pool for the local actors here in Ireland, and the casting directors are going, well, that's going to be very difficult to achieve because we don't have a community of black actors here. We feel a huge obligation to respond to that progress and that movement and that momentum. Not just reflecting Ireland back at itself in terms of the diversity we see on the streets, but also responding to the really positive change that's happening, particularly in TV and film production. And actually, I do think, in terms of throwing down a challenge to my theatre colleagues, theatre will catch up, but it needs to catch up. It's fallen behind. We need to think about how we create equality of opportunity. Like that, I think it's a wonderful term that I suppose learned or came to understand the true meaning of through the Waking the Feminists process. A lot of our actors, our black actors, have spoken about the fact that they don't imagine themselves going to theatres in Dublin because they know that they won't see themselves on the stage. It's the classic, you can't be it if you don't see it. So I think theatre organisations have got to ask genuine questions about how can we make the work more diverse, how can we make the opportunities equal, how can we make our organisations, not just in terms of the artists on the stages or the artists that get to make the work, but in terms of the audiences who are interested in seeing the work. How can we guarantee that we're having a conversation with the whole nation and not just the white middle class portion of our nation? And these are questions, I suppose, that have, that theatres have been grappling with in terms of class and disadvantage for a long time. But we need to structure the conversation around ethnicity in particular and racism in particular in a way that guarantees change and guarantees meaningful change. And we have the capacity to do it. We have organisations there, for example, like Irish Theatre Institute and Theatre Forum, who are there to build capacity across the whole industry. And I think it needs to be at that level. I think it needs to be a sector-wide conversation about how can we engender real change in Irish theatre that will mean that it is more welcoming to graduates of the Lear and other actors and artists of colour, because we have a lot of work to do.